All right, we'll get started here. Well, thanks everyone for coming to the final session of the day ahead of the reception on the show floor. I hear there's mostly sodas out there, so don't worry about getting up too soon. So again, thanks everyone for showing up here. My name is Dan Meyer. I'm editor-in-chief at RCR Wireless News, and we've got a pretty good panel here. I'll let them introduce themselves quickly, but topic here today is, I'm guessing one that's pretty near and dear to most of the members of CCA, bringing high-speed broadband to rural America. We're going to kind of take a look at it from the policy and trends aspect, and probably more of a, I don't want to say technical aspect of it, but looking at IP transition and things like that when it comes to the impact that has on taking broadband to rural America. So with that quick introduction, we'll start off, maybe just give a quick intro for everybody in the panel. We'll start that way, then kind of jump into some of the questions. So here with Mike, yeah.
So first of all, let me thank CCA for letting me attend here. I appreciate the chance to come out and present on rural broadband issues. I'm Mike Romano with the NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association. We represent about 900 small rural telcos who are in the fixed and mobile wireless business, as well as fixed landline broadband. Obviously, the big focus of those coming from incumbent telephone company history, but no longer incumbent telephone companies. Members in 46 states, all exclusively operating in rural areas.
Julia?
I'm Julia Tanner. I'm a Vice President and General Counsel at MTPCS. We are a group of Cellular One companies, and these days we currently are focused on southern markets, including parts of Texas, Louisiana, and the Gulf of Mexico.
And Chris?
Hi, I'm Chris Nierman. I am Senior Counsel Federal Affairs for GCI. GCI is the largest Alaska communications provider. Provides statewide mobile, voice, and data. But we are also a cable company, Wireline company, internet company, and as of last year, we are now a broadcaster as well. So we do a lot in all areas of the communication space.
Take care of the whole pie. Yeah, definitely. All right. And Doug?
Yeah, thank you. I'm Doug Minster. I'm Vice President of Government Affairs and Regulatory Affairs for Atlantic Telenetwork. We have 9 separate subsidiaries that operate domestically and internationally. We operate in Bermuda, Turks and Caicos, U.S. Virgin Islands, Guyana. We also operate in the southwestern portion of the United States, providing both wholesale and retail, and in particular on very underserved areas. We too have wireline properties in the New England area. We're not in broadcasting yet.
But soon. So, well, as you can see, we've got a pretty good panel, again, made up of mostly with carriers and associations as well. So I think a pretty good panel here that's some good insight into what's going on. Obviously, these companies here, there's carriers in the audience as well. You know, you guys are all kind of in the same boat a lot, so you guys are pretty familiar with the issues that are going on. But again, for this panel here, we're going to look a little bit at, focus a bit on the IP transition and the impact that's going to have for bringing rural high-speed broadband to rural America. And so I thought we'd start off with just kind of getting a general overview from each panel member, kind of their view on the plan, how the panel member, how they see the FCC, how they're handling the transition. Obviously, it's been a multi-year process, it seems, multi-decade perhaps, I don't know. It seems like it's been on for a while. But I guess get a general view of kind of where we are, how it's been progressing, how you feel the FCC's done with which is obviously a very important topic, but also a very complicated process as well too. So maybe Mike, start with your general view there.
Sure. So NTCA, we filed a petition back in November of 2012, right around the same time AT&T did, talking about the IP transition and how the FCC should look to tackle that. When the question came in about what do you think of the FCC's IP transition plans, it's a little bit of a difficult question because I'm not sure quite yet what the plans are, what the role of the commission is, quite frankly. I mean, they have a role quite clearly, but defining that well, I think they're still working through that a bit themselves. If it's how to manage an IP transition, well, I think as everybody knows that the transition's already occurring. The FCC itself has acknowledged this. So, and I think some folks have previously positioned it as if the FCC has to sort of help the IP transition along or make the IP transition happen, the FCC doesn't have to flip a switch and have that happen. It's happening naturally already. If the question that what the FCC's IP transition plans are is how to help change rules and due in part to technology changes, consumer changes, preference changes, competitive changes, those are very important questions, but I think at this point, that analysis hasn't even really started. I mean, the FCC largely said, we're going to deal with that later, and for now, we're going to do trials. And so we invite people to come in and do these trials. One other thing I'll note before I come back to the trials real fast, in our petition, we suggested the FCC do sort of a holistic review of the rules in light of those factors I mentioned to take a look and see if things needed to be changed to address the IP transition, basically to catch up and make sure that the rules are at least in as good a place as one can predictively get them to help stimulate or further accelerate that transition. The other thing we suggested was a technical track, which are a lot of things that the TAC, Technological Advisory Council, is doing right now. That's where the FCC really can, I think, play a key role through numbering database administration, other things that really are the questions that the IP transition, the industry needs to address. Everybody can address it on a one-off basis, but the FCC can be a key party in this to help people figure out where are we going to do IP translations and numbering databases, how are we going to do that, how are we going to make sure all stakeholders have a play in that, it's not a pay-to-play system. Those are important questions that the FCC, I think, to the TAP right now is addressing, but that's a key regulatory role. Coming back to the trials, again, we're not, quite frankly, I'm not sure what the trials are trialing. AT&T's got a trial proposal out there. They're looking at a couple of wire centers to convert to all IP. Many of our members have already converted to all IP. I mean, the only question is how you interface with the consumer at the location, allow them to still plug in their phone that they buy at Walmart or whatever it is. So again, the rules don't need to change necessarily to convert to IP. There's perhaps something more to that. Another company called Iowa Network Services, which is actually a member of ours, also filed a petition. It's a statewide network, fiber network. They actually ended up withdrawing it because after conversations with folks, they realized that essentially their position was we don't need to necessarily change anything. We just want to make sure that we keep doing the things with the way we used to do them, even as we convert the technology. In other words, the rules don't necessarily have to change in order for us to continue to just do our business. We can convert to IP in the network and continue to operate. So they ended up withdrawing their petition. But at the end of the day, I think two things we would love to see out of the IP transition that I'm not sure either is really well defined yet is a holistic review of the rules for some of the changes that need to happen, and then a technical track, which I think is to some degree more on pace, but obviously we're going to need to continue that in the TAC and then at the FCC itself.
Get your comments on
Okay, well, I mean, it's interesting because there are two ways you can address the IP transition. There's obviously wireless side, the
Sure, yeah.
online side, which the Commission's proceedings primarily addressing. And so I think I'll talk a little bit about both. So on the wireless side, we've all transitioned our networks on the data side years ago, but the voice over IP transition is obviously still occurring. I mean, there are over-the-top apps, but that sort of VoIP isn't really what's involved. It's more a matter of the true voice over IP, which is probably going to occur with VoLTE, and I'm aware that T-Mobile has VoLTE going nationwide at this point, from what I hear, and that AT&T has trials going, that Verizon will be rolling out some trials in the coming weeks. So it seems like things are really progressing on the wireless side, and I think that's all interesting. There are challenges to be addressed, as I know some of your other questions may get to, but on the landline side, obviously that does impact us to some extent as well. My engineers are actually very excited about the transition on the landline side because to some extent it may make things easier for us. And I think the FCC got it right in terms of its timing, but maybe a little late. It's good that the petitions came in to give them an excuse maybe to start thinking about it formally. I'm sure they've been following it. I get the impression that this proceeding at the Commission is really about gathering data, and I think that's useful. I think that that's necessary, and I think part of their concern is the impact on customers as the landline networks transition to IP. I'm really watching the impact on the wholesale customers. There's been a lot of activity in the record, a lot of comments from the CLECs. I know a lot of CCA's members have CLEC operations, so I'll be watching those impacts. I think that's interesting. But also the public interest groups are concerned after what happened in Fire Island after Hurricane Sandy, and also, so that's the concern about the withdrawal of power and how that can be addressed. I'm sure there are ways to address that, but right now, if you get hit by a hurricane, your landline phone still is working generally if you still have copper in your house because it's powered from the central office. These are things that can be separated. You know, it doesn't have to relate to the technology transition, and I understand that. I think most people do, but and also the impact on the deaf and hard of hearing. There have been some complaints about the new landline technologies, and I think again, as the technology improves over time, perhaps you'll tell us that these may go away. But I think it's a good idea that the Commission is looking at this. They do seem to be trying to gather data. The fact that they added support is something that I hope we'll be talking about later.
Yes, definitely. So, Chris, your insight there as a multi-platform.
Well, I agree with Mike and Julia that it's already happening. Has happened in a lot of places. I think trials can be helpful in providing data, especially as Julia mentioned, data on customer facing, how they are informed, how it will affect them, how it will affect the public safety 911. That you might be able to get some good data out of that. I think some of the things that the trials don't do are the maybe most important regulatory questions. The tech side is happening. What is the FCC going to do about the big questions of do 251 interconnection obligations apply to all IP? How are they going to handle intercarrier compensation while that is stepping down to bill and keep? As Mike mentioned, what are we going to do about the numbering? Are we going to use tentative numbers? How are we going to, those kinds of issues. So they're trying to do some stuff on the numbering test bed, but on the ICC and interconnection issues, these trials aren't really going to help at all. So those are the things that I think a lot of us are waiting for and are not going to be resolved here. I'm not sure when we're going to get to that resolution.
Okay, all right. Doug?
Yeah, so I got nothing. I shouldn't be sitting at the end of the table. No, I think in trying to find something to talk about here, I think one of the aspects that was interesting that I found was, and to your initial question was, is it too much,
Yes.
too little, too late? How big? This is a big item. I mean, it asked a lot of questions. It had a lot of things that were thrown up against the wall. Experiments. Subsequent information from the FCC has kind of quantified what those experiments look like, how much money might be available, the data collection obligations that flow out of that. I mean, it's big, it's broad, and it's extremely, I think, ambitious. It's also very aggressive in terms of the time frames. You get 1,000 expressions of interest to do some of these experiments. We've got a deadline coming up in the middle of October to file some of these applications to do these experiments. I'm curious how many of those 1,000 people or entities or expressions of interest will result in real applications. Another aspect that I found kind of interesting was there's some discussion in there about trying to determine where wireless might be more efficient or a substitute for wireline in terms of deploying broadband. And I think that's going to be kind of an interesting debate going forward. It rolls into a lot of other issues that we're discussing, that we're hearing discussed here. Things like interconnection and equal access, things like universal service support, and whether and how there will be universal service support for wireless broadband and how deep it'll go. So I think it raises an awful lot of issues. I think it also raises a lot of questions that are going to have to be answered in future proceedings.
But it does seem like, in general, the technology aspect of it is, the progress has been made. It seems like everybody's moving along. It seems like, at least from the technology side of things, it's just a matter of now, the FCC has to commit at some point and then lay down some rules for the interconnection, for interface on this, and that's going to be perhaps the challenge that we're looking at is that's kind of the challenge going forward, is that aspect of it?
I think to a certain extent, progress has been made. I think it depends on what market you're in. So, for example, I referenced the fact that we serve some island markets. We're probably more advanced in like our IP transition or LTE or advanced deployments in the island markets. than we are out in the southwestern portion of the United States, where we have to, there's no fiber to the towers, so we got backhaul problems. We got to solve that with microwave shots. It's expensive, it's time consuming, it's challenging, particularly given the huge amounts of broadband that, the efficiency you realize from IP and LTE increases your needs in those respects. But the solutions aren't always there for getting it where you need to get it to, or even doing some of the, the IP to TDM type of conversions you might as you hand it off to a local carrier. I'm encouraged to hear that, local exchange carriers are eager about this or well underway, because that does solve the problem that we confront. But, I think the guys from our southwestern property say, the biggest issue now is, bandwidth and backhaul over extreme distances and difficult terrain. So there's progress, but there could be things like that.
And that's, I guess, probably what the biggest connection is with the wireless industry at this point is the impact it's going to have on backhaul and, transporting the network information back to the traditional network. So, does it seem like obviously, Chris, where you guys are located, obviously you do a lot of it in Alaska, but what impact are you guys seeing this having on perhaps the wireless side of your business up there? And obviously, you guys, like you said, you do a lot up there, and obviously you can, kind of pull from different parts of your business on things. But I guess what impact are you seeing at all from this on the wireless operation specifically for services up there?
Well, I think again it comes back to the technology side is happening, and so backhaul is obviously an issue in Alaska. So we have a rather large middle mile network that's hybrid fiber and microwave, but there are many places in Alaska that are still served by satellite. And so how is that going to feed in? I know in the distance learning telemedicine context, there are applications that are written for most of the world that simply don't work there because they time out due to the latency. Is that going to be a problem with cloud services and whatever's coming next on an all IP network? In addition, and it's not talking about what Doug mentioned in the conversion to TDM, it's not just the carriers getting together and wanting to convert, it is having the rules. If we deliver everything in all IP, are we going to get universal service support? How is the inter-carrier comp going to work? And so these are all questions that we may have technical solutions, but we can't implement further without knowing the rules of the road going forward.
Any comment, I guess, on the impact? You touch a bit on the wireless aspect of this as well. It does seem like, again, for a lot of carriers here, wireless is a big part of their business as well. I guess you've seen any significant impacts, maybe a little more on the wireless side, or is that progressing, you think, at a pretty good clip at this point?
Sorry, I just lost any significant impact of support of the US?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
For wireless, yeah.
Yeah, there are a lot of different support aspects that we could have.
Sure, yeah, I would touch part of that.
Okay. Well, so there's a few different angles. First of all, as part of the transition, the FCC laid out these potential experiments, and one of them includes support, and that's the rural broadband program. And the issue, I think, for wireless carriers is going to be that the performance metrics are generally aimed for landline carriers, because essentially it's landline carriers that are currently going through a transition. And so it's unfortunate, because I think wireless carriers were originally going to look to this program to perhaps replace some of the legacy support, which is going away eventually entirely, apparently, for wireless. So they looked at this. Some of the metrics seem difficult, if not impossible, for some wireless carriers to meet. For example, there's a 100 gigabytes usage allowance. Now, if you look, I was just looking at AT&T, their family plans don't include 100, it's 50 for the family, that's the max. So that's more, coming from the landline side, and what landline carriers can provide. We are spectrum constrained. It's just not the sort of thing that I think most wireless carriers would desire to do with their spectrum. That's just the reality. On the other hand, landline carriers cannot provide access to 911 from an infinite number of points outside of a home. So, we each have different things that we can offer, and we were hoping that the performance metrics would let each carrier come in and say, hey, here's what we can provide. Not how is wireless like wireline, but really, how is wireless different? what might be interesting and different that we could bring as an experiment in this transition, because I think a lot of wireless carriers have pretty unique and interesting offerings and things that they would like to do on the IP side that might be a little different. Another one that some carriers are looking at askance at is the speeds. So the largest category of support, which is 75 million, is allocated for carriers that have speeds at, what is it? It's 25 and something like that. We're both blanking because it was too high. So the next two categories, which might realistically be endeavored by, I think, most wireless carriers, are 15 and 10, respectively, $1 million availability. And those experiments are requiring 10 and 1 speeds. And I think 10 on the downlink, if you have a 10-year term, you might ultimately get there. Right now, 10 is really what you're looking at, for some distance outside of your tower, but not throughout your entire network, unless we're talking theoretical speeds, which the commission isn't. So that, I think, is, I'm being a little long-winded, but that might make it a little challenging, and therefore I'm not sure if there's much availability there for wireless carriers. Michael would probably say that's fine, because that's not who the program was designed for. I'm not giving you an entree. I am not done yet. Sorry, I got me going on some board. Just keep going. But another thing is, if the commission is interested in getting the next generation of wireless out there, IP-enabled wireless, what really would help is support for those of us that do serve rural areas. And instead, as you know, the commission's grand transformation has withdrawn support from all the areas we currently serve. And they want areas that are farther out to be served. That's going to be, I think, a little challenging, because you need the entire network to have some potential avenue towards support in order to have your core supported sufficiently that you can. And on the landline side, basically the price cap carriers have rights of first refusal going. Their existing network areas are not, to some extent, being taken off the table.
We're not price caps. So.
Yeah, I know you guys are. Yeah, the RLX, believe me, the distinction is completely not lost. The RLX have some phase downs that they've been fighting as well. So, it's understandable. So, for example, in Montana, as was recently reported in the press, my company has withdrawn from Montana because of the withdrawal of legacy support, and unfortunately, we've had to leave some customers stranded. And I doubt that the commission would be happy about that. We're not happy about that, but they're not going to have any wireless service in some areas, and I think some of them may have no telecommunications service at all, because frankly, USF is an important part of serving some rural areas. Montana is the 4th biggest state in the country, and it's way down the list on population density, almost at the end. And so some support is an important component of that. So in any event, and plus Montana had some unique aspects to the way that the cap was implemented there. A little different, and so it was essentially 20% ahead of the curve on the cap. So as the cap phase down goes, we're a little concerned that in other states, as the next phase down occurs, other states may follow. But in any event, if the commission is interested in supporting IP-enabled wireless, I think it has to look at that. I think it's important for it to look at that. So I think it's interesting that it's looking at providing support in these rural broadband experiments. And I've really said my piece on this.
No, that's good. We'll like
so
and we'll get you guys well on that.
The rural broadband experience were an interesting kind of throw into the IP transition order. They're not quite clear how the two tie together, which is actually the most interesting part. And to your point about sort of how they're structured and what they're doing, in many ways, the rural broadband experiments were really, I think, an attempt to say, essentially, we have some Connect America Fund reserves laying around. We want to do something good with them. Let's try to basically test how we can do CAF2 better. And we've got this IP transition vehicle out there. Let's attach that to this and see how that goes. And so, in many ways, this was, while it's it's part of the IP transition item, it's really more part of the CAF2 item. And the rules were set up to basically say, all right, well, how much more can we get out of CAF2 than we're getting right now? Because in CAF2, we're kind of starting with a 4-1 metric. We might move to 10-1 as we're asking about in comments. And boy, wouldn't it be great to see if for each dollar we could get 50 or whatever. And so that, I think, is the progression of how we got to these rural broadband experiments. Those rural broadband experiments actually aren't occurring in the areas where our members serve. Our members, again, just to be clear, 900 small telcos, but Most of them have CLEC operations. About a third to 40% of them have wireless operations in the mobile wireless business. So we're not quite, we don't own our own broadcast stations, but we're pretty close to a GCI in terms of the scope. I want to know if you're going to buy your own spectrum at auction. The rural broadband experience, I think, presents an interesting opportunity for folks to get into unserved areas and edge out. It'll be interesting to see where those follow, because I think a lot of those are going to be in the outlying parts of price cap areas, and who's going to want to initially go serve those are going to be the least densely populated portions of a lot of the price cap areas. So I think some mobile wireless folks and fixed wireless folks could make great plays there, depending on the speed requirements and other things that include the ability to meet those, which they may change those for CAF phase 2 again for the rural broadband experience, though the markers are down and they sort of are where they are. I do want to come back though to a point that Chris made too, and I think Doug as well, talking about some of the other challenges. Backhaul. Backhaul that too is sort of an IP transition piece that's occurring naturally. Our members in 29 states have put together statewide fiber networks, and those fiber networks provide backhaul to all sorts of locations, towers, what have you. Again, sometimes they're not reaching deep enough necessarily yet into the price cap areas, but backhaul, middle mile transport is going to be one of the great challenges. It's happening already incrementally over time. We're seeing these fiber networks come together. They're reaching out to more towers over time, but it still is a challenge. Chris raised another point though, the regulation and interconnection. I mean, that's going to be critical. For universal service used to be at least about not just building networks, but keeping them there, right? It's about keeping services affordable and available on them. We've kind of turned universal service into this like stimulus-like or stimulus-light concept, where it's let's throw a bunch of money, auction it off, see if we can get networks built, and hopefully they'll be self-sustaining in 5 years or 10 years or whenever. Solving that interconnection piece is going to be a big part, because that's a big piece of keeping services reasonably comparable. If you've got, the last presentation in this room talked about the fact that 50% of the traffic on the internet at this point is Netflix and YouTube. If you've got increasing bandwidth demands and you've got to fulfill those from remote and rural areas, those are hundreds of miles of transport that you're not going to be able to solve for in terms of a cost issue without having interconnection rules of the road in place or universal service programs to support them. Those are going to be costs that are going to make it impossible for companies serving only rural areas to keep their prices reasonably comparable, because they've got to bake those middle mile costs into a very small customer base. The only way to do that is through either universal service, better interconnection rules, and or intercarrier compensation. Each of those three are still a puzzle, I think, that we're just beginning to scratch the surface on, and that's an important part of the IP transition. It's going to be those interconnection rules of the road. The last comment I'll make is, I'd say the canary in the coal mine on this is rural call completion issues. If you want to know what the world looks like when there are no rules or nobody on the sort of beat enforcing the rules in a systematic way, the FCC is trying its best, I will say. I mean, they are trying hard to crack this nut, but in many ways, things already got out. And so now they're trying to put everything back together. We're seeing calls fail, destined for rural areas. That's what a world looks like without effective rules of the road and somebody who's got the ability to police those. The FCC is trying, but I don't think we want to see an IP world where decreased consumer expectations are the norm.
Well, maybe I don't know, Chris, if you obviously you're in a state that I've been told has a very low population density, and so I mean obviously this is support for this is obviously pretty important. I'm guessing for operations there. I don't know if you have any comment on how that's been handled. I guess at this point.
Well, yeah, I agree with Mike that I don't know that the rural broadband experiments were too well thought out and designed for. You're more tactful than I am. They weren't really designed to tell us a lot about the IP transition. I think they had money and wanted to get it out. I mean, I think one of the things that is a little odd is that, and this goes to Doug's point, 1,000 aren't going to come because a lot of the carriers and parties that expressed interest were rate of return carriers, and this only happens in price cap areas. So it's taking out a huge swath of uncertain areas where this could be useful. In terms of support, obviously support is a huge deal in Alaska because of the size, because of the terrain, because of the climate, because of the population density. There are markets that are just will not be served without support. And so making sure that support is part of the post-IP transition world is extremely important. Without it, I mean, you know, and as I said, that's driving some technical decisions, not going to VoIP in certain areas, not doing that, and that is in part because of the rules. So we need to know the rules not only on USF but on interconnection. You know, there are those who say that, you know, we don't really need 251 like interconnection rules. Internet people are just like, there are no such rules for the internet. And is that true or not? And I don't know how the FCC is going to get to that answer and a decision on that question.
Yeah, sure. Well, before we, I guess, get off this topic here, we're a little more, another question, maybe Doug.
Well, let me stick on the support issue for just a minute because you know, it's a critical aspect. It's not something, we don't draw a whole lot of legacy USF support. We got some Mobility Fund Phase 1 and in Mobility Fund Phase 1 Tribal. And we're anxiously awaiting Mobility Fund Phase 2, whenever that might be. I do think that the broadband experiments, you know, whether they were bolt-on later on or whether it's because they had excess money, I think it allows some further discussion on an issue of importance to everybody who's here, which is it seems like an awful lot of USF support is going to a wireline industry when consumers seem to be voting that wireless is their preferred method of you know, communicating going forward. I mean, and not just when you're in your car or when you're out and about, but also people cutting their cords when they're home. Nevertheless, $300 million one time to the wireless industry in Phase 1, and we sit here and wait for Phase 2. That's why I find the discussion about, you know, can wireless more efficiently deliver broadband speeds at a certain level than wireline guys can, and should that influence, you know, other policies, including support policies? I think in some areas the answer is going to be no, you can't do it more efficiently. I think in a lot of areas that are currently kind of on hold, the right broadband experiment with the right data submitted to the FCC could bolster the position that, you know, wireless is a more efficient method of delivering these services. It might not be, you know, 50 meg down or something like that, but something that people can actually, you know, get a lot of use of, find a lot of utility in currently, and ought to be supported for that reason. Not to the tune of, you know, what they've currently proposed, which is $500 million for Phase 2, if and when that happens. Have at it, Mike.
Just a couple points. So the issue you're going to have, though, right? We just talked about the challenges of backhaul, and so, you know, you're going to have to figure out how do you get backhaul to those locations where it's needed and make it robust enough. I mean, you know, if you go out in any rural area right now, you know, I just was up in upstate New York a few weeks ago. I was out in Montana recently as well. You know, you get off the interstate highways and you happen to maybe wander beyond the small towns, and the coverage is limited unless it's frankly some areas where our members serve or, you know, some of these other carriers serve who are more, you know, committed to this community. Used to serve. Well, in Texas, Southwest, or wherever. I mean, you know, but you're going to need to solve for the places where, you know, to date, wireless is not quite there yet. You need to solve the backhaul challenge for when you want to get on network. And I understand the desire to have, I guess one of the other things I'll note too is I don't necessarily buy, I think CCA did a good job in its comments of highlighting the fact to the FCC recently about the mobile coverage, and is mobile coverage really accurate? I feel like a lot of universal service determinations are being made on imperfect information. And I'm not talking about like individual trials or something, I'm talking about maps. I mean, the National Broadband Map, other maps seem to be replete with problems about overstated coverage or missing information. I mean, the E-rate maps that just came out were probably the best example of this recently. The FCC, to its credit, said this is something we're kind of in work in progress and we want to get more input on it. But the maps there were missed a whole host of fiber-connected schools that people had to sort of crowdsource and self-report in. So, you know, I look at it and say, how are we going to answer the, you know, give people broadband? What's the way to get them broadband at home in areas where, you know, challenges in terrain and topography make it hard. You know, you can't. How are you going to put up so many towers? How are you going to have so much backhaul? How are you going to handle increased capacity demands? You know, the chairman's speech last week on broadband competition was interesting. I think everybody had something to like in that, something that made them very nervous. And I can see why, from a wireless perspective, one would look at the speeds that were talked about and say, we're nervous. I think everybody's wondering how we're going to get to those. But I do think it's important to have a scalable universal service policy. That is kind of what the rural broadband experiments are trying out, is to see what's the best bang for the buck we get in terms of the most capacity per USF dollar. There may be a different value of mobility. There may be a need to fill in mobility where the market isn't doing it. I mean, the FCC's even in wireline universal service policy, it's changing that, right? It's not just you get kind of universal service the same way you used to. Now we're going to look to see where the market can't satisfy that demand. And in those places where the market can't, that's where universal service goes. There are challenges with that. You need to make sure you know, again, the data that shows where the market isn't satisfying that demand. But at the end of the day, I do think that trying to get towards a more scalable network through a universal service policy isn't necessarily a bad thing. Recognizing, again, our members provide mobile services as well. There's going to be a need for a complementary mobile service to give people that capability, whether it's need for public safety access, whether it's mobile broadband.
Yeah, what we found, there's 2 points. I want to address data, and I want to address that last point you made about being a wireline carrier but having a wireless product. In Guyana and South America, we're on the verge of deploying all kinds of fancy new services because we are both the LEC and the wireless carrier. We're AT&T. We've got a local wireline service that is able, and fiber backbone, and it's able to very well support what we do when it comes to lots of bandwidth at the tower. And that's a great thing. So we've made great strides, but in Guyana, because we've got that kind of potent combination. To your point about data, the fact that there's this imperfect data on which these decisions are being made really came to the fore in something I was working on recently. I was looking at our subsidiary in the Virgin Islands, U.S. Virgin Islands, and it showed 0%, both the NTIA's figures and the FCC's figures showed 0% penetration of wireline broadband at any speed. And I used to live down there, and I have a lot of friends who live down there, and I'm here to tell you there's wireline broadband down there. It's not real great. It's certainly not what we're accustomed to here. And the only penetration it was showing was the wireless broadband providers. If that's the kind of data that the NTIA and the FCC have, there's a little problem with the data collection, and if decisions are being made on that, then there's a problem with decisions.
I also wanted to address just one point that you made, Mike, which is just, I'm glad we're in agreement on a lot of these issues. I do think that the FCC should assign some value to mobility, not just looking at performance characteristics that are based on speed and usage allowances. And, I think I made that point slightly before, but I think it's important to point out mobility has its own value. And I think that that's something that the Commission could look at.
I guess there was any concern yesterday, Wheeler, with this conversation with Steve Berry. The USF issue was brought up, and it did seem like Wheeler was perhaps maybe not standoffish on it, but he did say that his point was it's not his money basically. I mean, it's USF is the people's money, and you have to kind of be careful how you spend it. Were his comments at all a concern for any of our panel members here?
No, it's mainly the money of our customers because wireless contributes the vast majority of the support to any industry sector. Back in 2011, I believe, we were contributing in was it 44%? And those numbers we all know have only gone up due to the increasing cutting of the cord by customers. I think 2 in 5 Americans have cut the cord at this point. So we know that we're contributing more and more as a percentage of USF, and I don't say we, meaning us personally, I do mean our customers, and we care very much about their support and how it's being spent, but we do think that Americans are saying, especially in rural areas, that they're interested in having it spent on wireless services.
I think this goes back to the point about data. I mean, no one disagrees that we don't want to be wasting consumers' money where we don't need it. The problem is we don't have a good picture of where we need it and where we don't. And so the Commission's recent proposal to reduce the amount of money going to the mobility fund based on coverage from AT&T and Verizon, or LTE coverage, I'm not sure those numbers are right. So if we're going to be making big decisions like that, we really need to make sure the data is there. And I haven't seen how that's going to happen in the near term.
Yeah, I mean, one other point is, I think 101% of Americans have smartphones or mobile phones. So in other words, we've achieved such penetration, it's more than the population. So people have more than one smartphone and more than one regular phone. And also, a lot of people have said that it's, in many areas, it's less expensive to deploy wireless. So if you're talking about efficient usage of support, you should always look at this industry as well.
Yeah, one other thing, just on the question of fixed broadband, I mean, one of the things that we've talked about a lot in our comments, and this goes back to something that maybe Chris said before, there are pieces of the legacy regulations that do impede this IP transition. I'll give you an example that's near and dear to our folks' hearts. The rules right now are set up in a way that universal service dollars for smaller companies who only serve rural areas flow based upon, ironically, that customers purchase a plain old telephone service, even in the wake of the Connect America Fund initiative. So it's ironic, at a point where a customer chooses to cut the cord for voice. And a lot of times I think what we see is the customer cuts the cord for voice, but not necessarily for broadband, or wants to. They want to keep fixed broadband because, again, of the capacity needs they foresee over time, trying to watch videos, to engage in whatever other distance learning initiatives, via home healthcare, whatever it is, they want to have a fixed broadband connection. So, but yet the rules that are in place today actually preclude them from doing that, because the moment that today they cut the cord and go to a wireless voice product, the moment that they cut the cord actually in a conceptual sense and go to, say, Vonage over the top, universal service support in that line is lost, and their broadband price at least doubles per month. So they go from, the average we found was $52 to $110 per month. That's just inconsistent with sort of the attempts to transition towards this IP world, to set up Connect America funds, for example. It's a real problem we have to solve. This is one of the pieces that we think actually works well for wireless carriers too, and our members on wireless operations. The consumer then can have a fixed broadband product that reduces their price on the fixed service side. They take a wireless product that's complementary to that. They have wireless voice, they have wireless broadband. They might even buy, say, Vonage over the top, VoIP from our members, whatever it is. Our members can't sell a customer interconnected VoIP today without fear of losing universal service support, and the consumer's price is doubling for fixed broadband. That's an example of an issue that needs to be fixed, and that's an issue that I think would, again, make the ecosystem better for the consumer, for the mobile wireless provider, whether it's affiliated with our member or not, and for the customer in terms of for our member in terms of being able to continue to deploy affordable and provide affordable fixed broadband service.
I have a few more topics here, but before we do that, we're getting a little low on time. I did want to maybe have any questions from you on the floor. Anybody has any questions for our panel members? We have a very good panel here, have some great perspective on things, so if you might have any questions for our panel members on any of these topics? Anyone? I'll let you think about that for a second. Okay, all right, we'll move on. Well, I did want to touch, but it was brought up a little bit earlier. One of the issues we'd like to transition is ensuring 911, emergency services, things like that. That's obviously a very important part of this. How is that being handled, tackled? Is it being looked at with enough importance, do you think, at this point? And what kind of hurdle is that going to be, do you think, to this eventual move to all IP? I mean, obviously it's got to come along for the ride. Any thoughts on how that's going to be handled? I don't know. Who wants to start? So I'll pick someone.
I'll start. So we've been involved in the FCC's examination of next generation 911. One of the things that we're finding actually is the biggest impediment, again, as always, it seems to be money, but it's the PSAP's ability to upgrade their equipment, their facilities to handle IP interconnection. In a lot of cases in the states, 911 funds aren't necessarily being used only for 911, they're used for other purposes. And so, or if they're available, they're not necessarily covering the cost of upgrades for hardware, for example, or software, or maintenance on it beyond that. So in those cases, I think we actually just did a survey that showed what the number is. 75% of our members have dedicated trunks to their PSAP, and then the remaining go through the RBOC, traditional RBOC tandem. But 96.5% of those connections are in TDM right now. And the reason being is largely because the PSAPs just don't have the capability yet to upgrade. When that upgrade occurs, I think any number of folks could make that IP connection available. Been talking to the FCC about next generation 911 reliability, trying to help figure out how to address that issue. But it's one of those issues where without sufficient funding, it's going to be hard for the PSAPs to make that leap. And I'm not sure necessarily it's a technical issue in the sense that they need to get the hardware and software, but again, the market solution is out there. It's just finding a way to finance the deployment of it and use of it, at least from our members' perspective.
Doug?
No, I was going to say pretty much the same thing. It's a big part of the debate about text to 911. Carriers have to be ready, carriers have to have business plans and identify what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. But it seems that conspicuous by their absence is, a PSAP can trigger all that. And boom, it's a full stop there without talking about, is the PSAP capable of doing any of these things? Even some of the more fundamental stuff beyond, before you get to, E911 or hyper-specific location capabilities or certainly IP transition. Just some PSAPs in areas that we serve can't trigger fundamental early phase kind of compliance. And it comes back to the money, and there's not a whole lot of discussion about your state or federal funding mechanisms to get them ready.
Take care of us. Again, out to the audience. Any questions? Anyone? Everyone's still awake? None? Yeah, that's good. All right. Well, maybe to wrap up then, maybe, there are a couple more topics we were going to dig into, but we're kind of low on time, so I figured maybe we'll just kind of finish up with maybe looking forward a bit. Maybe if we should have remember, I guess, what you feel is perhaps the biggest challenge you see as, to kind of this move to IP, this IP transition movement. What do you guys see as being, maybe short-term, long-term type of challenge moving forward right now? Whether it's regulatory, obviously financial seems like always a big part of it. But just get your general view kind of to wrap up what you see as being a big challenge going forward on this. Let Doug go first. Wow.
I took his first spot.
Something that was kind of interesting that was raised yesterday that I think is, maybe the elephant in the room is, does the FCC pick a date where this is all going to be cut over? And I hadn't really thought about that because we're so busy looking at these experimental orders that have come out, figuring out our own operational issues. At some point they're going to say, you got to shut off all the legacy networks. Will they do that? Maybe they have to say it, maybe they don't. Will they do that? When will they do that? And I think that's not a challenge, but it's an interesting question. I've already kind of sketched out what our challenges are on the transition, but I think it's kind of interesting now that the FCC is active. Whether they're thinking about that and when they might, speak on it.
Chris, what are your thoughts on that?
So I mean, as I mentioned before, I think most of the challenges are regulatory and figuring out what the rules of the road are so that people can deploy the technologies out there and develop new technology. In terms of challenges of deploying mobile broadband, in Alaska and elsewhere, middle mile is huge. It's expensive. It's hard to get there. It still relies heavily on satellite in a lot of areas. One topic that we haven't talked about is the potential effect of net neutrality orders, Title II regulation. There's been a lot of discussion about the ability of mobile carriers to price, usage pricing, and that sort of thing, which in a middle mile constrained world is a necessary tool to manage the network. And so decisions on that may have a big and negative effect on the ability to bring mobile broadband.
That's obviously, I know, that was a topic I think we were going to try to touch on, but I figured that would require another hour at least to dig into that one, so I didn't want to get into it yet, but right, obviously that's going to be a huge part of this going forward too. Julia, any thoughts there?
I think I would agree with Chris that regulatory challenges are the big issue, and I guess I wouldn't say challenges so much as the landscape and where the commission is going to take it from here. Obviously, support for the next generation is near and dear to my heart, and I've already touched on that. That might be my first priority. But secondly, I think the Title II issues are important because as we all move to broadband, the question is, we all know the Commission has essentially, some feel that it has exempted broadband from Title II, and Title II includes protections for competitors. All of us competitive carriers have benefited over the years from some sections of Title II of the Act, including sections 251 and 252, which require reasonable interconnection negotiations. But they don't include only that, and it's something that we tend to forget, but they also include things like dialing parity. So if you have a wireless network, you want to make sure that the landline carrier doesn't make its carriers or your carriers have to dial one and pay extra to reach each other, when its own affiliate perhaps doesn't have that going on. So there are all sorts of little competitive protections in Title II of the Act, which are important to us. And I think we have seen that some folks are arguing that as we all move to broadband, those protections will no longer apply. So I think we'll be watching with interest. It's going to be difficult for the Commission because all of these issues are coming up in the net neutrality proceeding, and the court, the DC Circuit, in the Verizon decision earlier this year, basically told the Commission, Commission, if you treat carriers as if they're subject to Title II, it's a problem when you say they're exempt from Title II. And so the Commission has a very difficult tightrope to walk on this. So we'll be watching that as well.
Obviously, that topic's taking a lot of public comments as well, apparently.
Millions, I hear.
Yes, I've heard a few, yeah. So, on my
Yeah, you can do some fascinating searches in the FCC's comment database. Well, actually, and I don't want to get into Title II issues too much because we don't have time, but as an incumbent organization that actually filed in favor of Title II or classification at a certain level, I think sometimes folks misunderstand the contours of this debate. In many ways, I think that this whole issue, rules of the road, net neutrality, even Communications Act update, to get into yet another topic with 2 minutes left. I mean, they're all basically the same question, which is what are the rules of the network that are going to apply for the next 20 to 30 years? And I think that's in many ways a big versus small question. How do you decide how two operators interconnect with one another, interoperate with one another, exchange data with one another, all for the furtherance of making sure that consumers on each end of that spectrum can talk to one another or exchange data with one another. I think all providers of a smaller size in particular worry about being left without any regulatory backstop. So I think that's an important issue. But your question about what are the sort of short-term and longer-term questions or concerns. In the short term, I think my biggest concern goes back to the data point a little bit. It's the complexity. I mean, I think the FCC is actually doing it. We've had concerns. We took them to the 10th Circuit, so we're not necessarily big fans of the 2011 order. But at the same time, they're trying to go to a place that I think makes sense, and it's the complexity, the paths one has to take to get there that are hard, and one has to make. I think the word experiment or trial kind of concerns me because I feel like universal service is too important a concept to experiment with. If consumers can't get service, you've got a problem on your hands. So it's something that needs to be really data-driven and with manageable transitions in mind in the short term to make sure that we're thinking through, we're not pulling threads in a way that unravels the entirety of the sort of fabric that we've got of universal service. And that then leads into the longer-term piece. What are the longer-term challenges? Making sure that universal service stays about sustainability, whether it's in a TDM or IP world. Making sure that it's continuing to be not just about consumers getting access to a world-class network today, but making sure that actually universal service is oriented towards making sure that those consumers have affordable, robust broadband services each month as they choose to adopt each month on an ongoing basis. So that to me is the key for the long term, is to have that right destination in mind rather than having it be about how many headlines we can grab in terms of this network was built without thinking about is that network going to be there if we made an efficient use of universal service dollars to have that network be there, have it be scalable, have it be robust, and have it be affordable for the consumers 5, 7, 10 years from now.
Well, luckily the FCC has not much on their plate right now anyway, so they can handle probably most of the stuff in the next year or two, I'm guessing. But yeah, that seems to be the other issue too, is it seems like in the short term the FCC does have a lot going on in addition to this, but again, they're all important issues that, they have a nice staff and very smart people who can handle it, but it does seem like they're being pulled in lots of different directions at this point. So, I think we have a couple minutes left. Any questions before we wrap it up? I think there's nothing on. No questions from anyone? Okay, well, then maybe we'll wrap up in a couple minutes. Obviously, there are some topics we can dive into, but I'm sure people would rather go to the reception, so we'll leave that for a further discussion later. But again, if you guys can join me in thanking our panel for joining us today.